Hi, everybody. My name is Ann Dorn, and I'm here today with Dr. Marco Rosaire Rossi. To introduce Marco, he is a doctor of political science and wrote his dissertation on the municipal socialist movement in Chicago and Milwaukee and the implications of that movement on the two-party system. Marco also has 2 master's degrees, one in international law and human rights and another in political science. He is a prolific author with a number of published articles and books, including a chapter in an upcoming anthology talking about the municipalization of resources and government. So, Marco, thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be here.
Can you just broadly and simply explain the difference between the concept of the strong mayor form of government and the alternative where the executive power is placed in the city manager?
Yeah, the way to understand this, take a step back and look at all the different forms of local government that have been popular throughout American history for general purpose municipalities. The first one that were really popular was the town hall meeting, where you have a bunch of people get together and they vote on policies as a group, and they usually elect a few people to kind of administer the process. That type of model, has really fallen out of favor. There's very few places that practice it in the United States today. I am originally from Vermont, and Vermont has a robust history of town halls, and it's still practiced in Vermont. The town I grew up in, Barre, Vermont, the city budget was passed by referendum, and we'd have a town hall meeting today, and everyone in the town would get together, and they'd have to pass a vote. The council couldn't authorize the budget without the consent of the people. So there's still some examples of that where local town hall politics, where everyone gets together and they decide the agenda and the policy, and they do real face-to-face democracy. So that's one type of model. The other models are what is referred to as strong mayor, city manager, and then commission. At certain times, there is some overlap between them. But a strong mayor is a situation where you have an elected city council and then you have an elected executive branch. So you have an elected mayor that's accountable to the people. Where you have an elected city council, you have a mayor, but the mayor is considered sometimes referred to as separate among equals. So it's a ceremonial position within the council. So they do the ribbon cutting, they will chair the city council meetings, they will sometimes give speeches, but they don't have any real power over the executive function of the government. Instead, the city hires someone to do that, and that is not an elected position, it's a hired position with a contract, with a set time that they have to function, and they can be fired like any other employee. And the last one is the commission form of government, where you elect a commission, so not a council in a traditional sense, a commission. And then the people on the commission are not only tasked with deciding the overall decisions for the municipality or the county, because there's a lot of county commissions, but they're also, each person on the commission is tasked with overseeing a certain administrative aspect. So the administrative power, the executive power within the government is folded into the legislator and divided among all the people who take on the legislative role. Those are the 4 main forms of local government that you have in the United States.
There's a lot of controversy around this, and people have a variety of opinions. When you have people making choices and decisions about your life who are not elected, those people are, by definition, not accountable to the voters of the city, right? Do you agree with that idea that having executive power with an unelected person is a problem, and why?
I definitely agree with that idea. I am very partial to having a very robust democratic forum for decision making, and thinking that there's a lot to offer in something that is more leans to a town hall style, or at least sufficient opportunities for people to participate and be involved. And the city manager styles of government really counteract, and they were designed to counteract that. The city manager style of government came about during the progressive era in the United States. The progressive was more aligned with a sense of that you were scientifically minded, that you were open to new things, and you believed in the value of efficiency. There was 2 wings of the progressive movement 100 years ago. There was a populist progressive wing that were concerned about the influence of big business over society. And then there was a business progressive wing, which believed in modernization, believed in kind of socially liberal values, but they wanted to maintain the structure of capitalism over society. machine governments, which are governments that are based on patronage. So people become active because the government is willing to give you something. You get involved within the political party or the political system because the government's willing to hand you out jobs. Or there's a lot of corruption to stuff ballots and control that process. These institutions of political machines kind of controlled a lot of life in America and a lot of urban life. And there was a real recognition of their corrosive effect on American democracy. There was a movement to get rid of them, but the philosophies of how to get rid of them really diverged depending if you were a business progressive or a populist progressive. The populist progressive really believed that we need to do this through greater democracy, and we need to do it by checking big business because they saw some collaboration between a lot of machine governments and big businesses. When they said more efficiencies, they said more like a modern corporation. And they were really explicit about this. They really thought that the modern corporation was the most efficient form of social organization. So they wanted to bring that into how local governments run. And they're conceptualized this as like, hey, a local government is essentially a corporation. We just have to refigure how this works. So the voters are basically shareholders. The city council is basically chairman of the board, and the mayor is kind of a CEO. But it's not perfect because the shareholders don't elect the mayor. So we need to restructure it so it's more like it would be in a modern corporation. And like, again, they were very explicit about this. You can go back and read the literature. They were perfectly open about this. So it started out initially with the commission-style governments, where you elect a very small group of people who oversee a particular aspect of administrating government. The first city to institute that was Galveston, Texas. There was a movement to try to take control of the government of Galveston because there was a very robust labor movement at the time. More conservative people were nervous about how much the government was spending and how responsive it was to the labor movement. They really pushed to make a more exclusionary form of government, and they got tremendous pushback from the population in all sectors. The city was hit by a major hurricane, and it was destitute. The rebuilding process was not going to happen. The state government threatened to not give any funding to the city unless they went to this transformation where they developed a commission-style government. The people relented, so they get funding to rebuild, and they had the commission-style government. And there was a promise that this new government would be corruption-free, because it's now developed this new efficient style of administering city services. It didn't end up being corruption-free. There was a lot of problems. And in time, the city went back. But the idea that, now we have this new model that's kind of based on how major corporations run, we can export that through a different area. A lot of places adopted commission style, but it really became popular with some modification and moving more to a city manager style, where it's not so much that when a person gets elected, they oversee a certain administrative aspect, but all those administrative aspects are concentrated in one figure, and that figure is hired by the city council. And the relationship that person has with the city council is supposed to be parallel to the relationship a chief executive officer, also a CEO of a corporation, is to the board. All right? The CEOs provide the board with all the information. There's no really independent analysis. There's not really a thorough separation of powers in a traditional sense, which the United States is really known for celebrating as a key aspect of democracy. The city council hires the person. They're supposed to work for the council, but that person gets all their information to how to govern to the council. So it's very rare, except in unique situations, that there's a rebellion of city councils against city managers. Usually if that occurs, it's because voters have decided to upturn the city council, elect a whole new group of people who, a particular issue during that campaign was to get rid of the city manager.
I've heard this from other folks as well here in Tacoma, that the reason we have a city manager is to avoid corruption. And I'm hearing from you that this form of government became popular partly in response to the labor movement and how responsive city government was to the labor movement at points and at times, particularly in Texas. Can you just unpack that a little more?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that people have to understand, and that the sociological, economic, and institutional factors that led to the rise of political machines, because these forms of government were really looked at as an antidote to political machines.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this idea of a political machine? What is it, and how does it affect people's lives?
So a political machine is a form of government in which the loyalty to the political system is based on a system of patronage. So in a normal political system, if I have a relationship with a political party, I am participating because I believe in sort of the values and goals of the party. In a political machine, those values and goals are completely irrelevant. What is relevant is how much that political system can guarantee me certain spoils. So if I am favoring someone to get elected, I'm doing that because that person is going to go around and favor certain spoils of their electoral victory to certain constituencies. And my total relationship is based on that patronage system. So that's really what defines a political machine. There are, of course, other aspects of it. I mean, it's referred to a machine, I think, obviously because a machine um, uh, implies some type of rigidity to it. And that, of course, is true. Machines don't operate on a real democratic basis. They operate on, a really rigid hierarchy. One of the great scholars of Chicago politics, when we talked about as a great machine, he started out actually studying the Soviet Union and the one-party communist state, and then he looked at King County in Chicago, and he's like, Cook County in Chicago, and he was like, this is basically the same system. This is also a one-party state that operates this way, where all their political dissent is stifled and suppressed. It's just not done in the way it's done in Russia. There's all these other channels going on. So I think that's the aspect of the political machine that really defines its character and what people really fear, and that's an understandable fear. A patronage system that's not relying on democracy is not a good system. But the idea that the city managers were a heroic foil to that's just not proven by history. And I just keep returning to that point. If you want a system to be more democratic, you want a system to be more accountable. What you do is you make it more democratic and transparent. You don't necessarily make it more professional and elitist. But there was a lot of crisscross, a lot of forms that were advocated also by populist progressive forces to deal with corruption that we've kind of adopted, that have made a lot of the mechanisms that political machines had completely obsolete. So one thing that I think people don't realize is, 150 years ago, there wasn't election commissions that printed universal ballots. Ballots were printed by political parties. That's why newspapers are so essential to political parties. And every time you formed a political party, you basically had to go out and get a press and start printing newspapers because you had to print your own ballots. So you could tell when the ballots were printed by the political parties, there wasn't a lot of uniformity, and there wasn't necessarily secret ballots. So that creates an environment where it's very easy to buy votes. And if I have a political machine that I say, okay, I want you to vote for me. If you do, I'm going to buy you a bunch of beer or buy you a meal and do it. Then it's very easy to do that when you have the parties printing their own ballots. Also, because there wasn't a uniform system of ballots, it was very easy to ballot stuff. It was very easy to print more ballots and have people vote more than once in a single election. There's some outrageous cases in Tammany Hall where the number of voters voted in an election ended up being greater than the number of registered voters in the area. So it was obviously there was some ballot stuffing going on, and a lot of the competition in the election wasn't just the normal campaigning; it was who could have the more unique system of corrupting the electoral process to win. And it was kind of known that all political parties participated in this. I shouldn't say all, but the major political parties all participated in this, especially in a lot of urban areas. But that's all gone. We all have election commissions, so that doesn't occur. Political parties don't print their own ballots, so that initiative doesn't occur. We also have things like inspector generals around to root out a lot of corruption. Another major thing that led to the rise of political machines is the fact that a lot of power in the political machines grew out of black markets, and black markets specifically around saloons. Because remember, this was an age where prohibition was a big deal, and there was a lot of struggle to close bars and stuff like that. And so if you had a bar, you have involved in liquor, you want to influence a politician, it had to be a lot of things that were under the table or in shadowy areas, and that of course leads to corruption. But we live in a different world. There are some still black markets, of course, around drugs and prostitution, like there was back then. But it's hard to see how they have the same industries that they were back then, the same sociological influence that they were back then. So a lot of the factors that led to the predominance of political machines just don't exist. In addition to that, too, we've just gotten really smarter and governing, and part of that is giving local governments more power. One of the major things that led to the rise of political machines is that a lot of governments were formed just didn't have the powers to actually govern. So a lot of the governing had to fall outside of the formal channels of the government. So, like for an example, I studied in Chicago, and Chicago is well known for having a robust and long political machine that was very difficult to root out. And there's a lot of speculation of why this is the case. And one of it is that Chicago has more governing bodies in it than any other state in the United States. And you're like, well, why is that the case? Well, it goes back to when the state was creating local governments. They put a real cap on how much revenue any local government could raise. This was, of course, done as a justification for we don't want to tax the population too much. But it meant if you wanted the government to do something in action and it hit its limit, you had to create a new type of government with a specific task to do that action. So what this did is that it never really creates a lot of waste, a lot of fragmentation, and a lot of just bureaucratic mismanagement. And the thing about political machines and why they rose in political parties is because the governing structure in the state level wasn't really structured to handle the fact that you had sort of all this new activity happening on a very local level. And when things come up, people still needed government to take action. So that action fell outside of formal channels and inside political parties. But we don't really have that anymore. We don't have it. We've recognized the importance of giving power to local governments. I think the relationship between local and state governments is much clearer, much more harmonious than it was then. So the chances of people having a social problem that's so intense that it suddenly arises that people feel must be done, that can't be done through traditional governments, it doesn't seem like that. It seems very unlikely as you'd have something like that occur. Which is, all these factors that led to the corruption and rise of political machines just don't exist. Now, the other part of that question is, did the movement toward professionalization, did the movement to these new city manager positions, these new commission governments, did they actually work and root out corruption? And a lot of people have tried to study this, and they say, no, not really. It's hard to always say because there's a lot of aspects that get mixed together, like a government will move to a city manager type position, but they'll may also introduce what's called Australia ballot, but secret ballots. Well, that really undercuts some of the machines. If you have a secret ballot now that you have an election commission that's formed, you cannot easily buy votes, or they'll also have an inspector general to oversee, or certain things will change that have been parallel. But a lot of people who've analyzed specific cases, it seems that more that political machines changed with these governments and were rooted out for other reasons than they were eventually destroyed by the movement toward professionalization, where you had city managers. So I don't think the issue of corruption is really a compelling argument, mostly because I don't think people really understand the sources of corruption, and I don't think people really understand the history of these forms of government.
It sounds, if anything, it's a kind of an antiquated way of looking at government at this point.
Yes, it's a very antiquated. And also, why were political machines so successful? Why were they last? Why were they successful? Why were they being so corrupt? They were that case because of lack of accountability. They were that case because they were able to operate in a very opaque manner. And when people make an argument for a city manager position, you have to raise the question. It's like, well, how much accountability is here? How much do we actually have oversight into what the city manager doing? If something goes wrong, how much do we actually have ability to hold that person accountable? Now, with a mayor, you can decide at the ballot box you don't like how the person's governing. You have a lot of people in society that will challenge that person's position. You can fight it out in the democratic process. With a city manager, that's much more difficult because the information the city manager gives all gets filtered through the council. You have the ability to choose the council, and the council can exercise authority over the city manager. But it's very difficult for the council to be confident in this position if the city manager is a full-time position with a full-time staff. They give all the information to council, and the council members are part-time positions. They don't have their own staff. They don't have their own dependents. They don't really can exert this was supposed to be their sovereign will of the people over the city manager in a really confident manner.
And that's just simply structural in some ways, right? Like when you don't staff people, when you don't pay them for full-time work, like there's just limited in their effect and their power. And then what I hear you saying is all the information is coming through the city manager. It's presented to council in a certain way that's designed to, suggest a certain outcome or the certain vote would be best.
Yes. That's exactly the case. So, and when you look at the history of city managers, I think it's really important to consider the context in which they came in, because a lot of time they were introduced explicitly to demobilize forces of labor, forces of popular representation. Like the main turning point in the professionalization movement to move to city managers was the struggle in Dayton, Ohio, which the movement for city managers, which said we're going to take aspects of the commission style government, we're going to add this new city manager, and we're going to show that it works, was really heavily mobilized because the socialists had taken power in that city. The Socialist Party had been elected, and there was a freak out among the local business throughout Ohio that they had to do all they can to destroy this, including ram through legislation at the state level to transform the government of Ohio to make it so there's less democratic, make it so there's less city council seats, make it so we no longer had the executive because the mayor was a socialist. And that transformation, it was considered a great success at the time, but really its whole objective was to an offensive to destroy the Socialist Party. And you look at this, where any part where the Socialist Party was successful, a defining aspect of their movement was a fight over city charters. That was true in Milwaukee. That was true in Oklahoma City. Every single place that they were successful, suddenly the question of democracy, the form of government was put on the table, because it was realized if the government's too democratic, you could have these forces that would be able to take over it and pass legislation in support of people that would threaten the interests of business.
So I want to understand that mechanism. Why is it that, city manager, so I clearly see some of the problems, right? Mm-hmm. And I can see it here in Tacoma. Like that's very clear to me that our city manager limits and controls the information our council members are getting, and that they don't have resources or not fully supported or staffed. But help me understand how the city manager's interests are aligned with business interest. What is it about this mix of ingredients?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that the city's, I would say it's not necessarily the case that the city manager is aligned with business interests. I would say it is the case, just a virtue of the position, that the city manager's position is aligned with managerial interest. And a managerial framework is aligned with business interests. Now, that may seem a bit convoluted or overcomplicated, but I think if you unpack it, you can really kind of see the connection between the two. The one thing important to remember and conceptualize this is a lot of the thinking about this transformation of government goes back to Woodrow Wilson, our President Woodrow Wilson. Wasn't just a president; he was a political philosopher. He was a president of a university. He was very learned, but he really was a believer of kind of that society should be governed by a certain elite. I mean, he was an extreme racist. He was definitely interested in that aspect of progressivism that not only valued efficiency and trying to make modernization, but that leaned into eugenics and whatnot. That type of thinking really just has a distrust of people. Really believes that everyday people don't have the capacity to govern themselves. And that type of thinking is just essential to the workings of capitalism and business. One of the main advocates of transforming local governments in this way was a sociologist. He was considered a progressive sociologist. His name was Charles Zebulon, or Zublin. He was Swiss in origin. But he wrote a book called Democracy and the Overmen. And for those who know, Overmen is referred to is the English translation of Uberman, which is Superman, which is the Nietzschean philosophy. So if anybody's familiar with Nietzsche has this idea that there are these supermen who kind of define history, that rise above the rabble and are just unique individuals, and through conquest and war and strife, they form themselves and they really define the character history, and we shouldn't have anything to bring them down. Charles Darwin took this idea and said, hey, I understand that Nietzsche's philosophy is completely immoral. I understand that it's destructive. I understand that it would lead to a life where we're all struggling against ourselves and there's nothing really good about it. On the other hand, I do think that he's right in that it produces the best people. And we should encourage this because this is what happens in business. And what we need to have as a society is we need to combine democracy with the Ubermen, where democracy contains aspects of Ubermen, but we need to make sure that they still have an elite that's above everyone else that really makes decisions. And because other people are just too stupid and too uninformed. The average voter is just too much of an idiot. They don't have attention span, don't have the intellect to handle these aspects of it. And so the whole city manager position, it's structure. Even if somebody personally may not believe that, I think a lot of city managers, they do believe that they want to serve their community. You talk to them, they do believe in like the idea of, the public good. But the whole aspect of city manager is that everyday people don't have the capacity to make their own decisions and have a role in the executive branch of government. That's not their role. Their role is to be periphery. They elect the people that then hire somebody else that then has the information to that gives to the people of government. And that whole process, it's not that it is intrinsically, I think, aligned with business. What I think is that it's intrinsically hostile to innovative new ideas and outside political parties. And then that ends up forming the status quo, and then that benefits business.
And it sounds like it's inherently distrustful of the people.
Yes, it's designed to be inherently distrustful of the people. Because if you're really celebrating the people, you're like, well, we should invite the people to have a say in how the executive branch is run, just like we do at the national level. All the arguments that people make saying that we have to have this model for the local level, you could turn as like, well, why don't we do it at the national level? And if we did it at the national level, no one would believe that we're a democracy. So if that's the case, why do we accept it at the local level? What's so different about national government compared to local government that suddenly this aspect of government, this aspect of democracy just completely falls apart? And we could even go further. I mean, there's no reason that you could need to concentrate it in one person. We can understand the mayor, you concentrate in one person, but there are executives that they have a board that makes the final decision, so you can get a variety of perspectives. We could do that. We could also, do more of a local town hall meeting style with certain decisions, have more direct rooms. There's all these different ways we could expand democracy in cities. But instead, since the progressive era, we've just been kind of wedded to this idea that this managerial aspect of governing needs to dominate. And now in the United States, I believe city managers and that style of government is the preferred style of government for most cities. Strong mayors are not far behind, but they've really been muscled out by the prevalence of city managers. And part of that, was just changes in American history, like the creation of suburbia. When we had all these new governments, this was a preferred style of government. After World War II, but we have had sort of this dominant forms, and these ideas going to dominate our country for over 100 years. And I think it really is time to change and look back and say, hey, maybe there was something we've lost by moving to this form of government.
And I think that leads us a little bit into Tacoma. So I know you've been following this process a little bit here in the city. Right now, the city of Tacoma is undergoing its charter review process, and we have an opportunity to change our city charter. Mm-hmm. And that allows us to bring up this question, should we have a different form of government?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think that the city should move to an elected executive. Definitely. I think it makes the city more democratic. It makes an opportunity for more innovations and more groups to get what they want out of the city. I also think that the city council needs to be bigger. One of the aspects we haven't talked about this is not just the effects on the executive branch, but the effects of the legislative branch, because this process of professionalization and transforming more managerial style, it also changed how council people were elected. Not only in the sense that, we went to secret ballots, which I think was good, but we got rid of districts. So it used to be, you'd elect people from a small district and everywhere. But over time, they started to get rid of all these districts and do at-large elections, which does benefit business because you have to have more resources to campaign over a larger period of time. So I think that you should have a robust city council with several districts, small districts, so that people with limited resources have greater means of campaigning. And really, the campaign isn't about how much money you have. It's about how much volunteers you're willing to mobilize and how you're willing to connect with voters. Governments that have that really see much more diversity in their political legislative body, and it is an opportunity for modern progressive forces like the labor movement to really get an opening in the government. I mentioned that I studied in Chicago. I know a lot about Illinois politics. Chicago is a unique city in that it resisted this process of professionalization, partly because there's machine politics was so strong they couldn't do it. But we've really seen in Chicago kind of a death of the political machine. In the new century, a lot of the people who really were machine players who were steeped in a lot of corruption, a lot of them are seeing prosecution. A lot of those forces have just died. They've just been, slowly whittled away. At the same time, compared to a lot of other cities, Chicago has this very large, robust city council. They have 50 city council members, which is, you think about it, New York is 3 times the size of Chicago, more than 3 times the size of Chicago. New York has 8.5, Chicago has 2.7, and Chicago has a bigger city council than New York. It also is, LA is more than double the size of the City Council, and Chicago City Council is 4 or 5 times the size of LA. So very big city council compared to the United States. And what do you see in Chicago? You see tremendous political diversity. DSA has more members elected in the Chicago City Council than any other city in the United States. It's because they have opportunities to do it because you have 50 different seats to challenge, and all of them are districts. So it's very easy for people with limited means to get a foothold and the power just through hustle and passion. So I think there is tremendous value to moving in that direction. And even, let's take it back here to Washington and not just talk about the labor movement, because a lot of this is aspect of racial representation and doing racial justice. We have here in Washington a really important history in Yakima, where the Yakima City Council was at-large city councils, and they were sued by the Latino community, saying this form of government was de facto discriminating against the large Latino population because it made it so the white people could vote in a block and always block out any representation of Latinos. And they were successful in a lawsuit, and it forced the city to move to districts so that certain areas of the city could get greater representation. So I think that just kind of shows that, moving to districts, moving to large city councils, it's an issue for popular forces who want to mobilize poor people, but also racial justice issue for racial groups that have been historically excluded from government. They have an opportunity to get in and get the representation that they want to.
All of this is so interesting to me. Do you believe that people would have more hope and take part in government more often if they felt that?
Yes. Yeah. So one of the things, another aspect of it that ended up having a real demobilizing effect on people is not just that city councils shrunk in size, that the terms for city council members were extended. It was very the norm throughout the United States that if you're elected city council, you only serve for 1 or 2 years, same through the mayor. And now, it's much more normal you serve for 4 years, So the terms were shrunk. They went to at-large elections with fewer people, and they went to nonpartisan elections. And nonpartisan elections really have a mobilizing effect. And a lot of, especially people who have less educated means, don't participate because you have to exert more mental energy to know the different distinctions between the candidates because they're not run on a party. Parties are so critical to conveying information to voters, especially people who have limited education. You can convey a lot of information to someone with a symbol or an affiliation with a political party. And when you go to nonpartisan elections, voter turnout starts to go down. So if you want to have robust participation in the system, make democracy much more local, make it much more easy for people to run, make it much more competitive, and introduce partisanship. I know a lot of people don't like saying that, like, oh, we want to, we think partisanship gets so ugly and it's frustrating, but partisan elections help mobilize people. It gives people an easy access to feel affinity to people, to understand, to feel like they have some basis for being involved. Nonpartisan, it's just much more harder for people to distinguish between candidates if they're not affiliated with a party. And when they are affiliated with a party, guess what? The party puts more energy into voter registration, into mobilizing voters, into getting out the vote. They do those things that are necessary that we want political parties to do to ensure a healthy democracy. So I think if Tacoma wants to move in a positive direction where we're encouraging greater democracy in the city, we would move to an elected executive branch. We would strive for a greater, more robust city council. We would ensure that every district of the city would have robust representation, not be afraid of small districts, and not be afraid to reintroduce partisanship and say, no, let's have a real, honest fight where we can ensure that people are going to know the distinction between the candidates. We're going to debate the issues. We're going to have a sincere discussion, debate about the things that affect our city, and we'll be open and honest about it. Yes, partisanship can get out of hand, but I think that one of the things that leaves the acrimoniousness of partisanship is when everyone feels like they have a say in the government. And one of the reasons I think that partisanship on the national level has gotten so out of hand is because people don't believe they have the say in the government. They're fighting over such small crumbs of aspects of the government they can control. So they feel so desperate about it, And so, giving everyone a little bit of power makes it so that they feel like they less have to kill their neighbor over the power that they do have.
If you could, right now it's June 2024, mm-hmm. as of the time we're sitting here and talking, and council is going to be deciding whether to put a recommendation on the ballot or rather not a recommendation, but council will be deciding soon mm-hmm. whether to have voters decide on changing our form of government. Mm-hmm. If you could say anything to council, what would you tell them?
I would tell them that um, I I would say that I know a lot of people get involved in the city government because they love their city. I don't want, I'm not someone who's overly cynical or think that, even if I disagree with people politically, that they're doing it for nefarious intentions. I know. But I would emphasize the way the city loves itself is through democracy. That's how you show you real love for the city, because that's you believing in the city to be its best. Just like you love a child by believing in it to accomplish great things by itself. And that's the same type of attitude I think people should have. And that goes back to ancient Greek ideas about democracy and what it meant to be part of the polis. And that was a real way of showing your admiration for it, is believing in it that way. So I would express some type of message to that and saying that I know you love the city, I know you appreciate being a public servant. I think all that is genuine, but the real way that you can affirm that love is by really trusting in a robust democratic process and guaranteeing that for the city.
Well said. It's amazing. Marco, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
Don't go anywhere. Can you, for me, just define political machine a little better?
Yeah.
Or let me ask